When it comes to Ben 10, there certainly wasn't a shortage of some pretty iconic villains across the Prime continuity. One iconic villain that most likely comes to mind immediately for most Ben 10 fans is Vilgax. Vilgax is most notable for his cold-blooded nature and ruthless tactics, consistently giving Ben a run for his money in a majority of his appearances. Despite his iconic status in Classic, when he was reintroduced in the UAF era onward, his quality as a villain sorta shifted to say the least. The degradation of pretty much any aspect of anything in Ben 10 certainly isn't new, and sadly the villains were no exception. There's a few villains who fall into this category, and while they do deserve their own video sometime in the future, for this video I want to focus on my favorite villain in the entire franchise. That villain being the chili fries loving copycat, Albedo. First debuting in Alien Force, Albedo would be introduced as Ben's evil twin, to put it in simple terms. Albedo would start out as one of the most interesting villains in Ben 10, but as the series continued, Albedo's treatment would get worse and worse. I want to take time in this video to establish who Albedo is and how he would become an iconic antagonist in the series who eventually had a fall from grace. To start things off properly, I want to first go over the episode that actually introduces Albedo, which is the Alien Force Season 2 episode, Good Copy, Bad Copy. Albedo first appears in the opening of the episode where he tries to gather information on Ben's whereabouts by attacking Forever Night castles. After some misunderstandings where Albedo unintentionally frames Ben, the two finally meet face to face. Albedo attempts to lie and claim to be the creator of the Omnitrix, which doesn't work, leading to a battle between both Omnitrix wielders. The first fight isn't terribly long, but thankfully there's a second fight at a computer store that's a lot more entertaining. This fight shows off interesting ways to counter each Omnitrix alien, such as Swampfire's mud rendering Humongosaur blind, or using Chromastone's energy to burn through Spider Monkey's webbing. After Ben runs out of power in a running animation that would make Kafagrigas blush, Albedo claims he doesn't need an alien transformation to defeat Ben, which ends up being a miscalculation as both Omnitrixes become stuck to each other when side by side. This gains Albedo a new makeover in the attention of Azimuth, who reveals to us who Albedo truly is. It turns out that Albedo is a former assistant of Azimuth's and created a second Omnitrix against his wishes. Albedo felt as if Ben was unworthy to wield the Omnitrix, and attempted to make his own. What Albedo didn't account for, however, was the Omnitrix's default DNA being Ben's. Thus he ended up becoming a genetic copy of Ben, and needed Ben's Omnitrix to change him back to normal. Since Albedo ignored Azimuth's warning of making another Omnitrix and putting others in danger by only thinking of himself, Azimuth refused to help Albedo fix his condition. The episode then ends with Ben unsure of said decision, as Albedo rots in prison. Before I go into detail on how well Albedo's character is established in his debut episode, I want to take some time to appreciate his character from a design and a concept perspective. Albedo's design at first is identical to Ben's, but after the Omnitrixes collide we get his proper color scheme. I love the red jacket and how everything on his jacket that was black or white gets inverted, although the white t-shirt is only in his debut, which is odd considering that it makes for a better contrast to Ben than both of them wearing a black t-shirt. I like how the white hair also complements his red and black color scheme, and something neat is that his red eyes in his human form also applies to his aliens. Whenever Albedo turns into an alien, not only does he carry over the red eyes, but he also has a red Omnitrix badge, which is a nice subtle way to differentiate himself from Ben's usual green. What makes Albedo interesting on paper as a character isn't the fact that he's an evil clone of the protagonist, but it's how he came to be. Whenever you see anti-versions of the main character, they're usually made by some artificial or supernatural means. Now that isn't to say the concept can't be done in creative ways, as a prime example of this done well is Dark Pit from Kid Icarus Uprising, one of my favorite characters in all of media, who by the way isn't actually evil, but that's a story for another time perhaps. My point is that Albedo's conception is one of the things that makes him interesting. Attempting to make a second Omnitrix just for it to genetically trap you as a clone of Ben Tennyson is such a creative way to implement an anti-Ben into the show, and fits the world of Ben 10 perfectly. But that's just Albedo's design and concept. What about his actual character and personality? I may have only covered his debut, but in just one episode, Albedo showed a lot of personality traits that define him. This is evident as early as the opening of the episode. This scene already gives us a good idea of the type of person Albedo is, someone who is somewhat stubborn and a little more violent compared to Ben. Look at how he uses Humongosaur here to storm the castle. He comes across as very vicious and animalistic. Not to mention Albedo disregards the valid confusion of the Forever Knights. He looks like Ben, and the Knights don't know of Albedo, so Albedo asking where Ben is will clearly not help. He's just frustrated and taking that frustration out on the Knights. Albedo can also be seen as very inconsiderate and selfish, as he ignored the fact that he could potentially endanger the universe and made a second Omnitrix for his own selfish need. Although, if there was one word I could use to absolutely describe Albedo, it would be arrogance. The one thing Albedo exemplifies multiple times in his debut alone is how much of a superiority complex he really has. The most obvious scene is probably his overconfidence when he fought Ben. Using his human form and underestimating Ben is what caused his downfall. But even when doing something as simple as ordering chili fries, his arrogance is as clear as day. In fact, I want to take the time now to appreciate Yuri Lowenthal's portrayal as Albedo. While he may have the same voice as Ben, when they speak side by side, the difference in tone and emotion really shows the range Yuri has for this character, as hearing Albedo talk feels like a whole new performance. I absolutely love how you can just hear the insecurity and vanity just ooze out of this voice.
You disgust me. You, this miasma you call food, its foul-smelling, oily digestive preparation, everything human reeks. I am stuck in a sticky, sweaty, noisy, hungry, hairy, smelly teenage human body, constantly craving chili fries and scratching myself in places I suspect are inappropriate.
Albedo's superiority complex is also exemplified in his motive to make an Omnitrix in the first place. He views Ben as unworthy for the Omnitrix and lesser than him, both in intelligence and species. Instead, Albedo views himself as the only one who is truly worthy to wield the Omnitrix, even going as far as to claim he should have Ben's Omnitrix if it's the only one that works. So you can sort of see the idea of how obsessive he would become of being the only one worthy of the Omnitrix over Ben. And let's just say that obsessive nature would get worse and worse as time goes on. He doesn't even apologize to Azimuth for any potential danger he could have caused. Instead, he claims his hatred for Azimuth, showing he prioritizes his vain image of himself over accepting the fact that what he did was wrong. Not to mention that it also shows that he's incredibly immature. These personality traits help define Albedo, and would be amplified in his later appearances. There are more traits I want to go over, but I'll save them for when it's best appropriate for this video. Now that we have gone over Albedo on a basic level, let's discuss how he's utilized with his next appearance in the Alien Force finale, The Final Battle. In the finale of Alien Force, Albedo makes an alliance with Vilgax, teaming up to stop Ben once and for all. Albedo's main purpose in the alliance is to capture Ben's allies, which he does successfully in the case of Gwen and Kevin. The way Albedo's fighting is utilized here is among my favorite for the character. We get to see a really creative and brutal use of Diamond Head's crystal constructs, and Swampfire using sleeping gas, something we never see him do up until this point. This leans into the violent aspect I mentioned earlier for Albedo as a character, but in some ways this also showcases his potential when it comes to his intelligence. He is a Galvan after all, and honestly, I don't think he'd make for a bad Omnitrix user when it comes to utilizing the alien's abilities, it's just that his superiority complex is what holds him back. What makes Albedo's inclusion in this finale really stick out is of course the introduction to the Ultimatrix. Albedo stole the Ultimatrix from Azimuth in the opening of the finale, and with the device in his possession, not only can he turn into any alien Ben has, but can evolve those aliens into their ultimate form. So I do plan to talk about all the ultimates in a separate video in the future, so I won't go into detail of my thoughts on every ultimate, but what I will cover is how Albedo uses those ultimates. I love that Ben goes Humongosaur first, so Albedo can flex this ability, and so us the audience can see the real difference and improvements between regular Humongosaur and Ultimate Humongosaur. Using the missile hands as a surprise attack in the air is pretty cool, and one of my favorite abilities given to an ultimate. When Ben loses the Omnitrix to Vilgax in the hero's escape, Albedo's alliance with Vilgax is terminated. Albedo gets jumped by an army of Bioid Humongosaurs in a low-key unsettling way. Don't worry Albedo, I know how you feel. I'm a Vampire Survivors fan. He only shows up again in part 2 as a means to give Ben the Ultimatrix for Ultimate Alien. This finale really does showcase the potential of how much Albedo can be interesting not only as a character, but also as a villain from a power standpoint. It's common knowledge that Ben is immensely powerful, and Albedo has his own Omnitrix, so having the Ultimatrix in ultimate forms help him stand out and not just be a counter to Ben's powers, but in a way also overshadow them, and is able to give Ben a bigger struggle than most villains. This is something Omniverse sorta takes advantage of, selectively, but one step at a time here. My point is that the potential is near limitless for Albedo. Albedo is now without a device, and somehow manages to escape Vilgax's ship when it crashes into the ocean and explodes. I'm gonna assume he used a library card. Those are handy for some fast travel. The next time we see Albedo isn't until the final season of Ultimate Alien, where we get to see another side of Albedo that I briefly alluded to. That side being his obsessive nature. Albedo returns in Ultimate Alien in the episode Double or Nothing. In this episode, he performs in a Broadway play about Ben's heroics now that he's a famous superhero. He does this not only to afford stuff and make a living, but also to gain some equipment for a mysterious device. One of the actors playing Ben's aliens, Hugh, makes up a lie that Albedo is making a Ben Tennyson lookalike doomsday device, which sounds ridiculous, but of course this is Ultimate Alien Ben, so he's gonna act without thinking. After a fight between both Bens, Albedo believed he managed to cure himself, revealing that the device's true purpose was to restore Albedo back to normal. This works for about a few seconds, and it seems that Albedo will always default back to human. I'm gonna save my thoughts on what is said and goes on in this scene for later, as it brings up one of my biggest issues when it comes to the writing. All that needs to be known for now is that Albedo is pissed and is still an enemy of Ben's. I'm not sure if this is intentional, but I like that Albedo's reaction when wanting to fight Ben for his interference is to turn into wrath, the alien known for aggression. Albedo's next and final appearance in Ultimate Alien is in Night of the Living Nightmare. Albedo uses a Dream Eater to trap Ben in a nightmare world fighting past foes or friends, except they're all mute and disappear faster than the invincibility frames in Sonic Heroes. Ben figures out that Albedo was behind all of this, and when the two of them have a confrontation in Mr. Smoothies, Albedo is afraid of Ben, believing he always wins no matter what, even if there's no logic behind it. Albedo's insecurity is what makes this episode so interesting. It's more than just seeing Ben unworthy to wield the Omnitrix. In a way, it's like Albedo is projecting. It's implied Albedo views himself as unworthy and is afraid of being alone, implying that the actors from Double or Nothing abandoned him off screen. This isn't even going into the twist of the episode where the dream world was actually Albedo's the whole time. And the episode ends with a pretty fucked up moment where a bunch of aliens are about to torture Albedo. Look at this lineup. Upchuck, Diamond Head, Armadillo. He's gonna look like this by the time they're done with him. Ultimate Alien Albedo may be less interesting from a fighting perspective, but I appreciate that his character has become more fleshed out. His fear and insecurity really makes him stand out as a Ben 10 villain, doubly so as he's a genetic copy of Ben. These two episodes sort of begin a decline of Albedo's sanity. Now I'm not talking nuts like Maka when she made a deal with this fucking thing. I don't know, me and my grandfather just started Soul Eater and I just really wanted to reference the show somehow. But his character leans more into like this obsessive nature where he's hell-bent on revenge and stuff. This is something that we get to see in Omniverse, which I'm sad to say is where things sorta start going downhill. Before that, however, I want to take a quick break from talking about Albedo's writing to go over a few appearances that he makes before the Omniverse era, that being merchandise and other forms of Ben 10 media. When it comes to merchandise, Albedo really only has one figure from Alien Force, which is the same as Ben's but in his red and black color scheme. I appreciate the art for his card though. It's pretty cool that he got his own pose instead of just being a lazy recolor of one of Ben's artworks as far as I know. He also gets an Ultimate Humongousaur figure with the red eyes and badge, which is neat I guess. Albedo also appears in some Ben 10 books, which I went over in my video all about them. I find it pretty humorous that he interacts with Sandra and Carl. I wish he had that in the show. Even in the books you can smell the arrogance reeking out of this man. Albedo's most notable appearances outside of the show, however, are the video games. In Vilgax Attacks, he appears as the boss for Moro Tessie, and he fights you with a few aliens. It's a cool boss fight, but that's all he really does, for the console version at least. In the DS version, he attempts to use Alien X, but gets trapped for a whole year in a debate with Bellicus and Serena. Okay, place your bets. What debate do you think they had to take a whole year? I say it was either if Dracia 776 is a good game or not, or how the fuck those seashells work in Demolition Man. This moment for Albedo is also referenced in Ultimate Alien as an alternate timeline, which was so crazy to hear given that it's from one of the video games.
Oh, there are hundreds of them. A world where Gwen found the Omnitrix. A world where Albedo turned to Alien X and was trapped motionless for nearly a year.
His most major game appearance is of course Cosmic Destruction, where he's actually the main villain. For most of the game, he's an evil Waybig, and his colors are different from Ben's Waybig, something that isn't a rule for Albedo's aliens in UAF, but would be a norm when going into Omniverse. Albedo's writing throughout the whole game is pretty good, and during the ending of the game, he gets his ass beat by Lou, since he ends up on the moon, which is pretty nice in terms of continuity. By the way, look at this fucking facial expression. The moment I saw this face, I thought of the commander from Shadow the Hedgehog immediately, where he goes, which is very fucking funny to me. Although I do want to mention that I prefer his appearance in Vilgax Attacks. Sure, it's only for one boss, but we get to fight him with multiple aliens. That doesn't mean the Waybig fight isn't cool in my opinion, because it is pretty damn good, but like I said, I'm more of a fan of his appearance in Vilgax Attacks. Now that we discussed all there is to UAF Albedo, it's time to take a dive into the dip in quality when it came to how Albedo was implemented in Omniverse. Okay, so I sorta lied. Albedo in Omniverse at first is actually better than UAF. I love a lot of the changes that they did for Albedo, and the first thing I want to go over regarding that is his character design. I love that he has a design for both the Omniverse 10 t-shirt and the UAF jacket, not to mention that the mirrored look is so good, especially for the jacket. I love that his hairstyle is the same as UAF but messier, and that he has paler skin with rings under his eyes. This Albedo design is by far his best design, and the best part is that these changes also apply to his aliens. He keeps the red eyes and badge, but now every alien has a different color scheme when compared to Ben. For example, Wildvine is a darker shade of green with black thorns. Goop is all red, Spider Monkey's colors are more akin to a Black Widow, Brainstorm gets a reddish pink, and so on. Many aliens that Albedo didn't use in the show got artwork later on of what they would have looked like. Some of my favorites include Snarrow turning his gold into silver, Diamond Head's purplish crystals, Atomics having this dark gray purplish color scheme with vibrant red bubbles, and Pesky Dust looking like he listens to Almost Dead from Shadow the Hedgehog on repeat. No, seriously, this song is so fucking funny. His clothes is not only mirrored for his human form, but also his aliens, but unless I'm mistaken, this only really matters for Humongosaur, as every other alien is symmetrical when it comes to their clothing. And before I forget, I love that he wears his device on the opposite wrist of Ben's, which is something they also did in the classic series with Gwen, where in the episode Tough Luck, the source of her powers came from an object that she wore on the opposite wrist to Ben's Omnitrix. Also, for some reason, they decided to change the pronunciation of Albedo's name. In UAF, they said Albedo, but in Omniverse, they say Albedo. I don't know how you have, like, some sort of weird inconsistency with the pronunciation of your own character, but if you want to know what I prefer saying Albedo as opposed to Albedo.
Albedo, my former assistant.
Albedo just played a collection of his greatest hits. Give it up, Albedo!
So far, Omniverse Albedo is at a good start. The design for his human form and his aliens are better than UAF. So let's see how Albedo could have continued to improve in other areas, just for them to go and ruin it. Albedo makes his present-day Omniverse debut in the episode The Ultimate Heist. The first thing I want to mention is that I love the premise behind the plot of this episode. Albedo disguising himself as Ben with everyone none the wiser is such an interesting concept. And I love that there are little hints sprinkled throughout the episode, such as his dialect and his addiction to chili fries. When Albedo reveals himself, we get some pretty cool uses of some of the aliens, such as Wildvine's tendrils for some ensnarement, and Big Chill's intangibility and cryokinesis to body some Techodons. When both Bens meet face to face, their first battle is pretty short, but I do like this little down tilt from Goop. Could you imagine the fucking hitbox on this thing? And even then he would still be a low tier. Albedo manages to get his hands on a polymorphic crystal, and with this item, he can finally become ultimate forms while Ben can't. Like I said, I won't go into too much detail on my thoughts on each ultimate individually, but I love the changes to the ultimates for Albedo, especially when it comes to the aesthetics. Each ultimate looks so good in Omniverse compared to their UAF counterpart. Albedo uses 3 ultimates in this fight, being Humongosaur, Echo, and Spider Monkey. The two battle in a mutual struggle until Argid steps in to knock out Albedo. Albedo is saved before any arrest can be made, and at the end of the episode, we see Albedo not only gain back his Galvan form, but also gain his ultimate form. The best part about Albedo in Omniverse is mostly the aesthetics. When it comes to his writing, it's about the same as UAF, at least for the time being. His fighting capabilities is a whole other story, but one step at a time. For now, let's move on to his next appearances in Omniverse, which are the episodes A Fistful of Brains and For a Few Brains More. In A Fistful of Brains, most of Albedo's screen time is him fighting with Ben, but at the end of the episode, Albedo reveals that he has kidnapped Asmith. And when we go to the next episode, in For a Few Brains More, it's revealed Albedo has captured Asmith in order to steal his brain. Before I go into any negatives, let's start with the stuff that I actually do like. Albedo and Ben's fights aren't too bad for this episode specifically, and I love that we get 2 new ultimates, one of Arctic Guana and one of Gravitac. When Albedo does finally gain Asmith's intelligence, he also gains ultimate enlightenment. Albedo has an existential crisis, coming to the conclusion that all of his efforts for vengeance as well as his envy towards Asmith is pointless. Albedo's ego blocked him from seeing that. I get that, but Albedo also just rambles about nothing here. I don't know, this scene is kind of dumb, but I do find it kind of neat since it's sort of like a way to summarize how Albedo's downfall really is due to himself. At the end of the episode, Albedo gets his ass kicked by one of Ben's new aliens, Atomics. This is a really cool debut, and I did talk about this in my last video where I ranked the first appearances of all of Ben's aliens. And I'm sure it's nothing but uphill from here for Atomics. But that's a story for another day. There is one more thing that does happen at the end of this episode, and if you're a longtime Ben 10 fan, you know exactly what it is. But we're not going to talk about that just yet, because I have a few nitpicks I want to discuss before I go into that decision that they decided to make. Regarding Albedo's fights, there's one nitpick that I feel is worth mentioning. In his debut back in Alien Force, as well as the Alien Force finale, Albedo's utilization of different alien transformations were a lot more creative and brutal. Humongosaur being animalistic, countering Ben with different aliens that can put other aliens at a disadvantage, and having creative uses for aliens we've never seen before in the case of fighting Gwen and Kevin. In Omniverse, we don't really get that. To be fair, you can make the argument that this also applies to Ultimate Alien, since Albedo couldn't become any aliens until the end of Double or Nothing. And for Night of the Living Nightmare, Albedo was in a world where he would lose no matter what. When Albedo fights in Omniverse, sure he does a few counters and stuff like that, but it's not nearly as entertaining. I mentioned that Albedo using ultimates is pretty awesome, but he doesn't do terribly much with Ultimate Humongosaur, and in Echo Echo's case, this is a really half-assed callback to Sonic Doom, a move that was a huge deal in Ultimate Alien given that it almost killed Ultimate Kevin. Ultimate Spider Monkey puts in some work, but what he does isn't something unique to Ultimate Spider Monkey. The fight in Fistful of Brains is okay, but I was just distracted by the fact that they remembered Brainstorm existed. Another nitpick I have is with Ultimate Albedo, or Ultimate Grey Matter, whatever you want to call him. The design is a reference to MODOK from Marvel, instead of being something more original, and his powers, while neat, isn't anything we haven't seen before, although the trapping energy sphere is pretty cool. When we get to reveal, I should also mention that it's thrown in casually at the end of the Ultimate Heist. It's as if they were like, oh yeah, here's Ultimate Albedo or whatever, now if you excuse us, we're on our way to give an iconic tennis player really weird unrequited love. Ultimate Albedo when it comes to execution is somewhat disappointing. But now let's get into the most disappointing aspect of Omniverse Albedo that would ruin the charm of his conception. When Albedo is defeated at the end of For a Few Brains More, Azimuth fucks with his DNA stabilizer. Azimuth decides not only to change Albedo back into a clone of Ben, but as a clone of 11-year-old Ben. This is just a dumb decision. If it's meant to be funny, it really isn't. Now he's younger, but it doesn't change how he fights or how his aliens look. It takes away from the charm of Albedo being a genetic clone of Ben. If they wanted more young Ben, you could just, you know, write more flashbacks or another episode or two starring Flashback Ben. The only credit that I can give is that I'm sure most Ben 10 fans thought of the idea of how Albedo would look in the classic series. But they don't do anything with Albedo interesting after this. From a writing and vocal standpoint, Albedo is now just young Ben, voiced by Tara Strong, so his arrogance is not nearly as impactful compared to Yuri Lowenthal when he's teenage Albedo.
And when we do, the annoying union between Azimuth and Tennyson will be dissolved. I like this guy. I almost feel bad for what we have to do to him. Almost.
And as far as importance, Albedo only makes 2 other appearances. One is the 200th episode 2-parter where we get multiple Bens from different timelines. There are 2 things that stick out to me. First off, Albedo is technically not an alternate Ben. I know that sounds really dumb, but just hear me out for a second. Albedo is not from a different timeline. He's a genetic copy of Ben, but that's not the exact same as, say, Mad Ben or Ben Zaro, who are exactly like Ben, not Galvins who altered their DNA by accident to become clones of Ben. And 2, Albedo is an afterthought here. He barely gets any screen time, and the only reason he's here is because of the fact that he looks like an 11-year-old Ben. I'm only mentioning his appearance here for the sake of acknowledging the fact that I'm aware he's even here in the first place. The Swordmaster from Anri's Way had more of an impact. The other episode Albedo appears in is Malgax Attacks, his final appearance. Before I get into Albedo's final appearance, there is aspects to his character as well as an issue I have with a separate character that I feel contribute to Albedo's mishandling in Omniverse for his second half of appearances. That being the increase in his obsessive nature, the feeling of betrayal, and the inconsideration of Ben. As established in the Ultimate Heist, Albedo regains his true Galvin form, so his goals have been met. What else is there to do? Well, of course, the one thing Albedo wants to do now is get revenge. In Ultimate Alien, when Albedo regained his Galvin form, he didn't care about revenge. He would rather quit while he was ahead, but because that ended up being sabotaged by Ben, and we later see that Albedo has deep insecurities and fears revolving around Ben, Albedo is dead set on revenge, which he does talk about in Fistful of Brains.
And what? I'm supposed to just forget the imprisonment? The humiliation? The chili fries?
Oh yeah, sure Albedo, like you weren't eating them like a pregnant woman or anything. Albedo's obsession for vengeance here can seem like a random shift in his sanity, but in Albedo's defense, I can understand why he would lose his mind. For starters, he's stuck in a body of a species that isn't his own and has been refused help, and when he finally believes that he's cured, it turns out to be false due to sabotage. Albedo is shown to grow afraid of Ben, especially given how he views his victories as non-logical. Not to mention that it's implied that his friends abandoned him, so all of these factors would drive him more to into madness. But there's one other aspect that I think helps us understand his need for vengeance and his madness, which involved Azimuth and Ben. Albedo was Azimuth's former assistant, and we actually see some of that in the Season 1 episode of Omniverse, Trouble Helix. In this episode, Albedo does nothing but praise Azimuth.
First Thinker Azimuth has told you he's busy, human. Accept it. How dare you speak to Azimuth that way?
But in his debut back in Alien Force Onward, Albedo has nothing but hatred for him. Azimuth's disapproval of Albedo wanting and creating his own Omnitrix to Albedo felt like betrayal. Albedo wanted justice for himself, and given Azimuth's cold reactions we've come to know him for, that fueled Albedo's anger and hurt more. Of course, Albedo did bad things, so I'm not justifying his actions. I'm just saying I understand why Albedo feels the way he does when it comes to the events that happened to him. And speaking of understanding Albedo and how he feels, I wish we got more of that from Omniverse Ben. In Albedo's debut, this is what Ben says at the end of the episode.
Don't know how much I like Azimuth not letting Albedo turn back.
And in Double or Nothing, when Albedo is supposedly cured, Ben is happy for him. In Omniverse, however, Ben treats Albedo's condition as a joke.
The humiliation? The chili fries?
Yeah. Chili fries are awesome. Get over it, dude.
To be fair, Albedo did try to kill him multiple times, but this could have been avoided if Azimuth fixed Albedo's condition while still sending him to prison. I'm really not big on the handling of Omniverse Albedo, not just for his utilization, but for how others react to him. Again, Albedo deserves punishment, but I can understand why he feels a type of way about Ben or Azimuth, or just his situation in general. It only gets worse when he becomes 11 years old. Dude has to go through puberty as an alien species twice. That sounds like a hell no one deserves. Well, except for him. So while everything I mentioned is pretty mishandled, do they stick the landing with Albedo's final appearance in the show? Well, let's find out as I talk about Albedo's screen time in Malgak's Attacks. Albedo's screen time in Malgak's Attacks is so mediocre. In fact, the whole episode is. The only interesting thing that happens with Albedo here is that he shows off a new ultimate, that being Ultimate Wrath. Seems like Albedo got that dogshit wrestling outfit as well. Albedo attempts to kill Azimuth, and nearly succeeds. But thanks to Blukage and Dreba's quick thinking, Azimuth is barely saved. Albedo's plan fails, his device no longer functions, and he's stuck doing labor for like 80 years or something. Well, that's an ending. I suppose you can call it that. Like, yeah, of course, Albedo's gonna be stopped and all, but this seems like such a lame way to conclude such a cool villain. I didn't even mention that in this episode, Albedo's working with Vilgax, cause that worked so well the first time. Though this could be a sign of Albedo being so desperate for revenge that he would work with anyone, even someone who double-crossed him in the past. I know not every character in Alien needs a grand conclusion, but imagine if Albedo became Ultimate Waybig and Ben had to fight him as Waybig as a callback to Cosmic Destruction. There's several ideas, I'm sure, but that was the first one that came to mind for me. Albedo gets an arc that has a stupid decision made and overall just missed opportunities, and his other appearances are afterthoughts and a mediocre rehashed team-up with Vilgax, where the two barely interact, by the way. To sum it all up, he ended up being misused by a stupid decision and lack of creative utilization. If I could choose a villain to team up with Albedo, there are two that come to mind that I want to take some time to talk about, on why I think they would make for better utilization for Albedo in terms of both powers and writing, as well as possibly be a better conclusion in the case of one potential team-up. So there are two villains that come to mind when I think of potential Albedo team-ups, and these two villains are probably very obvious choices. These villains are Billy Billions and Sonny Tennyson. Billy Billions works because they both share a common struggle, being stuck as 11-year-old kids thanks to Ben, whether intentional or not. This struggle can motivate the two to work together, and you can say that they both met because Albedo used Billions' tower back in For a Few Grains More. I could also imagine the two arguing over who's more intelligent, which has potential to be a little funny, not to mention that would also give us more Goat Zuma, and anything with her is automatically peak. As for Sonny, do I really need to say why this team-up is a good idea, considering that it's incredibly obvious why? They're lookalikes of Ben and Gwen, and if you want Kevin to have a rival, make it Darkstar, given that they both have energy absorption powers. With both trios against each other, you have a pretty cool idea for a doppelganger episode. For the sake of simplicity, however, I'm just gonna stick with Albedo and Sonny. Both Albedo and Sonny have jealousy of their counterparts, and also show more powers than them as well. Albedo has the ultimate forms, and Sonny is better at her anodyne abilities than Gwen is. Not to mention that Sonny didn't even get a proper appearance in Omniverse, so it would have been really cool if she teamed up with Albedo so we can give her some honest-to-God screen time. Albedo and Sonny is a team-up that many fans have spoken about as a missed opportunity in the past, so I'm shocked that it never came to light in Omniverse's runtime. I should mention that Billy works best if Albedo is 11, while Sonny works best if Albedo is 16. As 11-year-old Albedo takes the charm away from being a lookalike of Ben, since he no longer is one. By the end of either team-up, I like to think that Albedo is defeated, but maybe a hot take here. I'd rather him just escape to fight another day than to be stuck doing labor without any sort of way to have Ben's powers. Seeing one of Ben's most interesting villains no longer have the abilities that make him interesting as an adversary for Ben in terms of power feels like a letdown, end of the show or not. The two team-ups that I mentioned are just two potential ways to use Albedo though. I'm sure there's other really cool ways to utilize him, besides being what feels like getting shoehorned in a team-up that makes no fucking sense just because the show's ending. So there you have it. We see Ben 10 give us an incredibly fun implementation of an anti-version of Ben with an intricate backstory and further fleshing out as the show continues until Omniverse mishandles him. Sure, his looks got better, mostly, but his utilization overall is very flimsy. The worst of it to me is his change into 11-year-old Ben. This change felt so unnecessary. It's like they did it just because they could, and then didn't do anything fun or creative with it, ultimately leading to Albedo being ruined when it came to being a charming and interesting villain, which sucks extra for me as he's my favorite villain in the entire franchise. But as always, I want to know what you think. Do you like Albedo as a villain? Do you think Albedo was handled well throughout all 4 series? Or did you find a decline in Albedo's utilization like I did? How do you feel about his conclusion as well as him turning 11? Do you like the 2 potential team-ups I mentioned, or is there anyone else you would want to see Albedo work with? And lastly, does Albedo deserve redemption? Personally, I feel like he does deserve punishment of course, but maybe I'm too merciful, as I would at least turn him back into a Galvin before imprisoning him. I appreciate you guys for stopping by, and as always, happy night hunting.